1986 explosion of the Challenger marked a tragic moment, not only for the friends and loved ones of the 7 astronauts aboard the doomed shuttle.
The roar of the engines echoed across Cape Canaveral as the Space Shuttle Challenger stood poised against the bright January sky, its white frame gleaming in the sunlight. Families, journalists, and engineers watched with anticipation, their eyes drawn to the slender tower of human ingenuity, ready to pierce the heavens. Among the crew were 7 astronauts whose courage and determination embodied the spirit of exploration, a team that included teacher Krista McAuliffe, whose presence symbolized hope and education reaching beyond Earth. Yet beneath the excitement, a tension hummed through the launch site, a silent warning buried beneath the optimism. The air was unseasonably cold that morning, the Florida chill biting in a way that made even the engineers uneasy. Inside NASA's control rooms, discussions had taken place. Warnings had been voiced, doubts had surfaced. But time, politics, and pride pressed the mission forward. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The Challenger launch on January 28, 1986, was meant to mark another step in the shuttle program's confident march through the stars. NASA had built its reputation on precision and success, the agency's aura strengthened by decades of achievements that had captivated the world. But behind the polished image, cracks had begun to appear. Subtle yet dangerous fissures formed by ambition, bureaucracy, and the growing pressure to maintain the illusion of infallibility. The shuttle program had become not just a scientific endeavor, but a political and media spectacle. Each mission was a display of American prowess during the Cold War, proof that innovation and courage could conquer the cosmos. When the Challenger's engines ignited, it was not just a rocket rising into the sky. It was the embodiment of an ideal, a promise that humanity could defy gravity and touch the divine. 73 seconds later, that illusion shattered. The bright trail of exhaust split apart in the sky, a horrifying bloom of smoke and flame tearing across the blue. The cheering turned to stunned silence. Families, colleagues, and millions watching live on television stared in disbelief as the shuttle disintegrated before their eyes. For a moment, there was confusion. Voices in the control room trying to make sense of telemetry, commentators fumbling for words. The crowd didn't want to believe what they were seeing. The explosion was raw, unfiltered, and immediate. It was a moment when the dream of spaceflight collided brutally with the reality of human fallibility. Yet what followed in the hours and days afterwards stirred something deeper and darker than simple tragedy. The story of the Challenger was not just about an accident. It was about what NASA knew before that launch, the risks ignored, and the deliberate silencing of those who tried to speak out. Engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, had raised red flags about the O-rings, rubber seals that were known to harden and fail in cold temperatures. They pleaded for the launch to be delayed, arguing that the freezing conditions could prevent the O-rings from properly sealing the rocket's joints. They warned that this could lead to catastrophic failure. The data was clear, the danger was real, but the warnings were brushed aside. NASA's internal culture at the time had grown dangerously complacent. Success had turned to routine, and routine had turned to arrogance. Management wanted to maintain schedules, to show Congress and the public that the shuttle was as reliable as any commercial aircraft. Launch delays were politically costly. To admit that the shuttle had serious design flaws would be to risk funding and reputation. The voices of the engineers were buried beneath layers of managerial confidence. Meetings were held late into the night, but in the end the decision was made. The Challenger would launch. It was a decision made not on scientific evidence, but on institutional pride. As the shuttle lifted off, a small puff of smoke escaped from one of the booster joints, a signal of the O-ring's failure. Unnoticed in the moment but visible later in the slow-motion replay, the joint's seal began to erode, leaking superheated gas that weakened the structure. The cold had done exactly what the engineers feared. The gas burned through the metal casing, forming a growing breach that allowed flames to reach the external fuel tank. What followed was not an explosion in the traditional sense, but a violent structural breakup as the shuttle tore apart under forces it was never designed to withstand. The crew cabin remained intact for a brief, haunting descent, falling from the sky into the Atlantic. What NASA presented to the world in those immediate moments was confusion, but inside the organization, there was already the whisper of guilt. There were people who knew. There were memos, charts, and conversations documenting the risk long before that fateful day. Some engineers wept in silence, knowing that their fears had been realized exactly as predicted. But rather than confronting the truth, NASA's upper ranks initially focused on containment, controlling the narrative, maintaining composure, and avoiding the appearance of negligence. The world had just witnessed one of the most shocking disasters in the history of spaceflight, and the instinct was not to open up, but to close ranks. For many, the sense of betrayal was immediate and visceral. The space program had always been seen as a beacon of integrity, a symbol of science in its purest form. To learn that warnings had been ignored, that safety had been compromised by politics, was more disturbing than the explosion itself. The Challenger crew had believed in their mission, trusting that every detail had been checked, every risk mitigated. They had placed their lives in the hands of an organization that had promised precision and care. What they received instead was a fatal combination of hubris and negligence. The secrecy surrounding the incident's true causes extended into the investigation phase. NASA officials initially claimed that the cause of the disaster was unclear, even though internal discussions quickly centered on the booster joints. The agency released statements suggesting that the event was beyond anyone's anticipation, a tragic anomaly that no one could have predicted. But the engineers' documents told another story, one of repeated warnings, test failures, and ignored data. The O-ring problem had been known for years. In earlier flights, traces of soot and gas had been found where the seals had partially failed. Each time, the anomaly was written off as manageable, acceptable within operational margins. In the pursuit of maintaining its flawless public image, NASA had normalized deviance. Small signs of danger were accepted until disaster made them impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, there were those who tried to speak. Engineers and mid-level managers knew that if the truth came out, that a design flaw had been ignored, that the cold had been a known risk, the agency's credibility would be devastated. Efforts were made to redact memos, to frame internal communications in ways that downplayed the scale of oversight. This was not the behavior of an agency embracing accountability, it was the reaction of one struggling to preserve its myth. The Challenger wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a moral one. The disturbing reality was that NASA's culture had evolved into one that punished dissent. Speaking out against management decisions was seen as disloyal. Engineers who pushed back were labeled as obstacles to progress. In the tense environment of the space race era, where success equated to national pride, doubt became an enemy. The organization that had once embodied human curiosity had slowly become a system that valued perception over truth. And in the case of the Challenger, that culture killed. When the smoke cleared and the search team scoured the Atlantic, the question of what truly happened to the crew haunted the nation. NASA's initial statements were carefully phrased, leaving gaps in the story. The agency focused on the mechanical failure, on the explosion in the sky, but avoided discussing what occurred in the minutes that followed. The implication that the crew might have survived the initial breakup was too horrifying for public consumption. Yet, as evidence emerged, it became apparent that the cabin had remained intact long enough for the astronauts to experience the unthinkable. A free fall from the edge of the heavens, powerless, conscious, and aware. The discovery of the crew compartment months later forced NASA to confront that possibility. The systems within the cabin, including some of the crew's emergency oxygen packs, had been activated. That meant at least some of them were alive after the shuttle broke apart. The thought was devastating, that these 7 people had survived the explosion only to plummet helplessly toward the ocean. But NASA did not emphasize this detail publicly. To admit it openly would have magnified the horror, and it would have underscored how preventable it all was. The narrative that emerged instead was one of noble sacrifice, a tragic loss in the pursuit of exploration. It was cleaner, easier, and less damning. What was being hidden was not simply the mechanics of the disaster, but the culture that made it inevitable. The Challenger tragedy was not the result of a single decision, but of hundreds of small compromises, each made to serve deadlines and optics. NASA's structure had become rigid, its layers of management shielding upper leadership from uncomfortable truths. Those at the top had grown accustomed to success, and in their certainty, they dismissed the cautious voices below. The decision to launch in freezing weather was not an act of ignorance. It was an act of defiance against reality itself. The deeper one looks into the Challenger's story, the more disturbing it becomes. The idea that NASA, an institution built on empirical data, could suppress engineering truth for political convenience shatters the ideal of science as incorruptible. It exposes how even the most noble missions can be tainted by human flaws: ego, ambition, fear. It shows how progress, when pursued without humility, becomes its own form of blindness. Challenger was not just a tragedy of lost lives, it was a tragedy of lost integrity. The psychological toll on those who knew the truth was immense. Many of the engineers who had tried to stop the launch were consumed by guilt. Some left the field entirely. Unable to reconcile their role in the event, within NASA, morale collapsed. Yet even as investigations loomed, there were efforts to maintain secrecy, to redact memos, to reframe decisions as misunderstandings rather than misconduct. The emphasis was on preserving the agency's future, not on reckoning with its past. It was as if the lives lost were secondary to the institution's survival. This silence spoke volumes. When an organization hides behind bureaucracy after a tragedy, it reveals what it values most: control. The image of NASA as a beacon of transparency and innovation was carefully curated. The truth, that warnings were ignored, that internal dissent was crushed, that data was bent to fit expectations, was an inconvenient blemish on the agency's legacy. The Challenger became, for those who looked closely, a case study in how truth can be buried under layers of authority. What makes the event so haunting is how easily it could have been prevented. The cold weather was not an unforeseen anomaly. The O-ring failure was not a mystery. The data was there, the warnings explicit, and yet the decision to proceed was made. It forces a painful question. How many other institutions make similar choices, valuing optics over safety, politics over ethics? Challenger stands as a warning, not only to engineers and scientists, but to any system where the pursuit of success outweighs the duty of honesty. The launch that day was televised precisely because NASA wanted to inspire the public. The inclusion of a teacher, Krista McAuliffe, was a deliberate effort to bring space exploration into classrooms, to show that space was no longer reserved for scientists and pilots alone. Children across America watched from their desks, their eyes wide with excitement. What they saw instead was the raw face of tragedy. And what the public did not see, the internal struggles, the silenced warnings, the quiet cover-ups, made the event even more chilling. It revealed how a dream could be corrupted by the machinery that claimed to protect it. The Challenger disaster became a mirror, reflecting the darker side of human ambition. It showed that even the greatest achievements can collapse when integrity falters. It revealed how institutions can convince themselves that risk is acceptable, that danger is manageable, until reality demands a reckoning. For NASA, the loss was not just physical, it was spiritual. The agency that once represented boundless curiosity had allowed bureaucracy to suffocate it. Even without discussing the aftermath, the implications of that day ripple outward endlessly. The Challenger explosion was not merely a technological failure. It was a collapse of trust between a nation and its most revered scientific institution. It was the moment the public saw that heroes could die not from the unpredictability of the cosmos, but from the predictability of human error. The disturbing truth that NASA tried to keep quiet was that this was no random accident. It was the inevitable result of a system that had stopped listening to reason. Each time the footage of that bright, beautiful morning replays, the countdown, the liftoff, the rising arc against the blue, it carries a weight that words can barely contain. It is a vision of human aspiration, interrupted by human failure. The Challenger crew, in their courage and dedication, deserved more than what the system gave them. They believed in exploration, in discovery, in the power of science to elevate humanity. They did not know that the very organization guiding them toward the stars was ignoring the warnings that could have saved their lives. What NASA tried to hide was not only the technical fault, but the moral one. That the tragedy was foretold and avoidable. The decision makers had chosen image over truth. The engineers had been right, their data irrefutable, their pleas ignored. When the Challenger was lost, the flames did more than consume a spacecraft. They exposed the fragility of human judgment when clouded by pride. The haunting part of the Challenger story lies in that silence, in the memos buried, the voices dismissed, the refusal to admit what was known. It is the silence that lingers after the roar fades, the silence that speaks of decisions made behind closed doors while the world looked upward, unaware. It is the silence of an institution that wanted to be flawless, and in doing so became fatally flawed. As the plume of smoke dissipated over the Atlantic and the nation mourned, the deeper truth remained hidden, shielded behind reports and press conferences that spoke of technical anomalies and unforeseen circumstances. But those within NASA knew better. They knew that the true cause was not the O-ring alone, but the arrogance that believed a shuttle could defy physics for the sake of a schedule. They knew that the Challenger had been doomed not by space, but by the very people who sent it there. That is what makes the Challenger disaster so profoundly unsettling. It was not a failure of machines. It was a failure of people. The attempt to hide that fact only deepened the wound, transforming a tragedy into a betrayal. The image of the shuttle's ascent remains beautiful, but now it carries the shadow of deceit. Behind every gleaming panel, every countdown, every word of reassurance, there was a hidden truth waiting to ignite. The Challenger stands as a monument to the dangers of denial. It reminds us that progress without accountability is illusion, that courage cannot compensate for arrogance, and that even the most advanced technology cannot save an institution that refuses to face its own flaws. The disturbing truth that NASA tried to conceal was not just about what happened to the Challenger crew, it was about how and why it happened at all. The faces of the 7 astronauts, Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, remain etched into history. They are remembered not just as victims, but as symbols of the price paid when truth is sacrificed for ambition. Their final mission was meant to inspire. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. The Challenger's legacy is not only written in smoke across the sky, but in the unspoken words of those who tried to stop it, and in the chilling realization that sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones told by those who should have known better. The Challenger didn't just fall from the sky. It was brought down by a system that chose silence over honesty, control over conscience. And in that silence lies the most disturbing truth of all, that humanity's reach for the stars will always be at risk, not from the vastness of space, but from the frailty of our own decisions. Long after the smoke cleared from the Florida sky, the questions surrounding the Challenger's final moments refused to fade. Beneath the surface of public mourning and official statements, the deeper mystery persisted. What truly happened in those last seconds aboard the shuttle, and what NASA didn't want the world to see. The agency maintained a careful line, releasing fragments of information while concealing the most disturbing truths. It was not just a matter of national embarrassment. It was a matter of protecting the institution itself. The Challenger tragedy was a wound that threatened to expose how deeply NASA's decision-making had diverged from its founding ideals. The unsettling part was how calculated that concealment seemed. In the immediate aftermath, NASA publicly emphasized that the explosion had been instantaneous, implying that the crew would have lost consciousness before they could register what was happening. But the evidence told another story. The cabin, as later analysis revealed, had remained structurally intact as it separated from the main body of the shuttle. The force of the breakup was violent, but not immediately fatal. Inside that compartment, surrounded by chaos, the crew may have been conscious, facing the unthinkable. A descent of over 2 minutes toward the ocean below. The idea that they had time to understand their fate was horrifying, and NASA did everything in its power to minimize that possibility in the public eye. That silence was not born of compassion. It was rooted in fear. Fear of accountability, fear of public outrage, and fear of dismantling the myth of control that NASA had so carefully cultivated. Admitting that the crew had been alive after the breakup would have raised unbearable questions. It would have demanded explanations about why the cabin had no viable escape system, why no redundant safety features existed, why no one had listened when engineers warned that cold weather could compromise the seals. It would have required NASA to face its own design flaws, not just in machinery, but in judgment. Within NASA's internal corridors, there was an almost ritualistic avoidance of blame. The organization that had once prided itself on meticulous engineering had become an entity governed by political optics. Each layer of management shielded the next, creating a labyrinth where responsibility was diffused until it vanished. Engineers on the lower levels were expected to provide technical data, not to challenge decisions. Managers higher up were expected to make the launches happen, not to second-guess the risks. It was a system where questioning authority meant jeopardizing one's career. In such an environment, truth became a casualty long before the Challenger ever left the launch pad. The disturbing reality was that NASA's leadership had become fixated on image. The shuttle program was meant to symbolize routine access to space, a reusable, reliable vehicle that could fly frequently, efficiently, and safely. Each successful mission was supposed to reinforce that image. Delays and cancellations were not just operational inconveniences. They were public relations disasters. The Challenger launch had already been postponed multiple times, and pressure from media outlets, school programs, and political figures had mounted. The White House itself had taken a keen interest in the mission's success, given Krista McAuliffe's participation as the first civilian in space. The event was to be a national triumph, broadcast to millions of school children as a moment of inspiration. Postponing it yet again would have been an embarrassment. So, when the engineers from Morton Thiokol begged for a delay, the weight of that pressure bore down on their objections. In the conference calls before the launch, their warnings were methodical and urgent. The O-rings were never tested in such cold conditions. The data clearly showed how elasticity dropped sharply at low temperatures. But the conversation turned not on data, but on interpretation. NASA managers challenged the engineers to prove that it would fail, rather than proving it would succeed. It was a subtle but devastating shift in burden, one that transformed caution into a liability. By the end of the night, the engineers' pleas were overruled and the green light was given. The truth buried beneath layers of bureaucracy was that NASA had crossed a threshold that day. From exploration to performance, it was no longer driven by the pursuit of knowledge, but by the need to maintain an illusion of control. The tragedy of Challenger revealed what happens when science becomes subservient to image. The decision-makers knew the risks, but convinced themselves that probability would be kind, that luck would fill the gaps where caution should have prevailed. That rationalization, born from years of success, became the agency's undoing. The public, meanwhile, was shown a simplified narrative. NASA's statements in the immediate aftermath spoke of an unexpected catastrophic failure, as though the disaster had been an act of fate. The language was calculated, passive, impersonal, and vague. There was no acknowledgement of human error, no admission of negligence. The official posture was one of shock and sorrow, but beneath that surface, internal communications revealed a frantic effort to control the message. Terms like O-ring failure and cold weather risk were avoided in early reports. Employees were instructed not to speak to the press. Documents began circulating internally with careful edits, framing the tragedy as a technical anomaly rather than the culmination of ignored warnings. What made this concealment so disturbing was its familiarity. Large institutions, when confronted with their own failings, often respond not with transparency, but with containment. NASA, despite its scientific brilliance, was no different. The organization that had once set foot on the moon now found itself consumed by self-preservation. And in doing so, it revealed a truth that no one wanted to face, that even the most advanced systems are vulnerable not just to mechanical failure, but to the frailty of human ambition. As the internal investigations progressed, whispers began to spread among those who had been close to the launch. There were technicians who had seen frost on the boosters, who had felt uneasy as they watched the countdown continue. There were engineers who had written memos warning of potential for loss of vehicle and crew, only to see their words ignored or buried. There were managers who admitted, off the record, that they had doubts but lacked the authority to stop the launch. And there were those who, in the aftermath, were pressured to remain silent to protect the agency's image. The atmosphere of fear and compliance that followed the disaster was as chilling as the explosion itself. The Challenger disaster also revealed how fragile public faith in technology could be. For decades, space travel had been romanticized. Astronauts were seen as near-mythic figures, and NASA as the pinnacle of precision. When the explosion occurred, it wasn't just a spacecraft that disintegrated, it was the illusion of perfection. People who had grown up believing in the absolute competence of NASA were forced to confront the fact that human arrogance could infiltrate even the most disciplined organizations. The emotional impact of that realization was immense. Inside NASA, however, a different kind of reckoning took place, one driven by denial rather than humility. Meetings were held to analyze telemetry data, to reconstruct the sequence of events, but the deeper questions, the cultural and ethical ones, were avoided. For months, the organization focused on mechanical explanations, almost as if solving the physics of the failure would erase the moral implications. Engineers who spoke out were quietly isolated. The few who continued to question official accounts faced immense pressure. To challenge the institution was to risk exile from the very field to which they had devoted their lives. The image of Challenger's ascent remains iconic, not because of triumph, but because of what it symbolizes about human overreach. It was a moment of blinding confidence, a belief that technology and determination could overcome even nature itself. Yet the bitter irony is that the cause of the disaster was rooted in something profoundly ordinary: rubber seals, temperature readings, and managerial indifference. It was not a failure of rockets or fuel. It was a failure of listening. And that, more than anything, is what NASA sought to obscure. Even the recovery efforts were shrouded in a strange kind of secrecy. The search for debris and remains was treated as a matter of logistics, not humanity. When parts of the crew cabin were found, the operation was conducted under tight security, far from cameras and journalists. The narrative presented to the public remained sanitized, focused on technical malfunction, devoid of the emotional and physical horror that those recovery teams encountered. NASA knew that the details would be unbearable and, more importantly, that they would reignite questions about preventability. So the agency drew a veil over that chapter, locking away reports, restricting access, and letting the public grieve without knowing what had truly been found. The decision to withhold information was defended as an act of compassion, but it was, at its core, an act of control. It was about managing perception, ensuring that the public remembered Challenger as a tragedy of fate, not as a consequence of negligence. Yet truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried beneath bureaucracy. Over time, documents leaked, testimonies emerged, and the sanitized narrative began to erode. The picture that took shape was not one of a single misstep, but of a pattern, a system where warnings were ignored, accountability was diffused, and image was everything. The Challenger story forces us to confront a fundamental paradox of progress. The same drive that pushes humanity to explore, to innovate, to reach beyond its limits, also tempts us to believe that we are infallible. NASA's brilliance was undeniable, but so too was its blindness. The agency had become a victim of its own success, convinced that past triumphs guaranteed future safety. The engineers' warnings clashed with that self-image, and in the end, the image won. What is most haunting is how ordinary the mechanisms of deception were. There were no grand conspiracies, no deliberate sabotage, just people making choices to protect their careers, their reputations, their institution. Each act of silence, each dismissed memo, each overlooked test became part of a chain that led inexorably to catastrophe. The cover-up was not a single event but a mindset, a quiet and pervasive unwillingness to confront discomfort. In the years that followed, the Challenger became both a symbol and a warning, a testament to courage and a reminder of hubris. The lessons it offered were written not only in technical manuals but in the human cost of pride. The tragedy revealed how fragile the line is between exploration and exploitation, between pushing boundaries and ignoring limits. It showed that science, when stripped of humility, becomes indistinguishable from recklessness. The 7 astronauts aboard the Challenger represented the best of humanity: skill, dedication, and belief in something greater than themselves. They climbed into that shuttle trusting that every precaution had been taken, every risk accounted for. What they could not know was that their fate had been decided long before ignition, in meetings, memos, and calculations filtered through the lens of politics and image. Their courage was real. The system that failed them was not. When people speak of Challenger now, they often recall the fireball, the twin plumes of smoke twisting in the air, the shock that froze a nation. But the true horror lies not in the explosion itself, but in what it revealed. That even institutions built on reason can succumb to denial, and that truth, when inconvenient, can be buried until it is too late. NASA's attempt to hide the full extent of what happened to the crew, to sanitize the narrative, was a final act of control in a sequence of decisions driven by it. It was a refusal to confront the humanity of the event, the fear, the pain, the responsibility. The Challenger story endures because it is not confined to spaceflight. It is a reflection of human behavior under pressure, the way ambition distorts judgment, how authority silences truth, and how systems built to pursue knowledge can become prisons of their own making. The disturbing part is not that NASA failed once, but that it believed it could not fail at all. The illusion of perfection was the most dangerous force of all, and when it shattered, it took 7 lives with it. Every generation that looks back at that bright Florida morning must grapple with that truth. The Challenger did not simply explode in the sky. It exposed the limits of trust, the fragility of institutions, and the peril of silence. The tragedy's meaning lies not in its spectacle, but in its warning, that the pursuit of greatness means nothing if truth is sacrificed along the way. And as long as humanity reaches for the stars, the story of Challenger will remain a shadow, a reminder that the most dangerous failures are the ones we refuse to see. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on NASA's truth about the Challenger crew's fate? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.